People who were in a coma, what change surprised you when you woke up? Back in the 90s, my great-grandfather had a stroke. He was in a coma for 3 weeks. And when he woke up, he could not speak English. All he could speak was the Choctaw language. He had learned it when he was a kid, because his family lived right near a Choctaw reserve, and he played with a lot of those kids. He spoke it fluently at that time, but forgot it over his life to where he couldn't remember any of it by this time. This went on for around 10 days, and then he woke up from a night's sleep and could suddenly speak only English again, not remembering a word of Choctaw. He was also able to repeat verbatim every conversation that had been held in the room that he was in. I was in a coma for 4 days. When I woke up, everyone was talking about the baby boy I had. I had lost my long-term memory and didn't even remember being pregnant. My son was at the children's hospital in the NICU. I delivered him via C-section at 29 weeks. All this was due to me having Crohn's disease. I found out after I woke up, my colon had ruptured during my pregnancy. My husband said I was talking like a child when I first woke up. When I woke, I felt super tired. But then the next few days, kinda restless. I remembered one conversation my mom had with a nurse while I was under. After a couple of days, I got my long-term memory back and remembered everything up until my second surgery, then nothing until I woke up. My son was my third surgery. Edit. So my son was what surprised me. My nephew, 14, was in a medically induced coma for over 3 months. During that time, he had lost about 30% of his body weight as his muscles atrophied. His first remark upon seeing himself for the first time was, "Did you forget to feed me?" Which was incredibly hard to hear since his family had sat crying at his bedside every moment he was unconscious. Little late to the party, but after a suicide attempt which led to an overdose, I spent about 2 days in a coma and almost died. While obviously nothing changed in 2 days society-wise, my personality changed heavily and I don't consider myself the same person as before the coma. I feel like that side of me died and different parts of my brain took over, creating a new personality and control. Sorry if this is personal, but do you think the parts of you that were suicidal died? Do you think you changed for the better or worst? It's kinda hard to explain, but I feel broken. Anything that's not in the present feels like fake memories. Do you know the feeling of acting on pure instinct? Like baby falls and you catch it without thinking or anything like that. Fate how every memory feels. I'm fully here but in less control. Medically induced for approximately a week due to sepsis. When I was in, I thought I was a bird with my wings outstretched that was slowly freezing to the ground. When I woke up, I thought I was in Taos, but it looked like Raton. I was in Albuquerque, in a hospital that I had worked in for years. I thought I was 10 years younger. I thought I had gotten into a wreck and my fiance at the time was an abusive ex-boyfriend. I thought my fiance had found me naked on the side of I-25 and had taken to a veterinary hospital. It took another month and a half for me to understand what happened. I was in and out of surgery and died a couple times in that time. Once, they were changing out my wound vac and I looked down and saw inside of me. Then things started making a little more sense. I still can't eat cheeseburgers. I was in a coma for a week. I was surprised by how hard emotional regulation is after a good long break from having to do it. I was okay when I started to come out of a coma. But then I'd feel tired or uncomfortable and I would just start bawling without really understanding why. Took me a few days to feel in control of myself again. My mother was in a medically induced coma for 5 months. When she was finally stable, they woke her up, and she had lost a lot of her memory. I am the youngest of 3. I myself am 23. My brother is 41 and my sister is 39. She could remember me, but she did remember my brother and sister and my dad. I have a different dad than my brother and sister. She actually thought I was a long lost son of my dad's because I look so much like him. When we tried to explain to her that I'm her son, she was completely confused and actually panicked a little. But then when I went home after being awake for nearly 50 hours, I got a phone call from the hospital just as I was about to go to bed. It was my mom. She remembered me and was crying hysterically that she'd forgotten about me. So I went back to the hospital and she hugged me and told me how sorry she was. I told her that it wasn't her fault and we both cried our eyes out. She's doing very well now and we're closer than ever. I was in and out of a coma state for 4 days after an overdose. I remember swimming in an ocean. Vividly. I remember drowning. I remember waking back up in the ocean and swimming again. When I finally came coherently to, I couldn't hear properly and didn't want to eat at all for a few days. I also felt like I just woke up from a surgery. I was extremely peppy and felt like I was swimming while moving. I felt cold and clammy too. Could have just been a side effect of the pills though. Woke up in a hospital not knowing what had happened to me. Ended up crashing a motorcycle into a Jersey barrier and had internal bleeding and broken bones. Lucky to be alive. Luckily someone seen me flying through the air when it happened late at night and they called 911. Q. Still don't know who this stranger is that saved my life. I was in a coma for almost 2 weeks after I had several surgeries resulting in my death and revival. Waking up was interesting. When I woke up, I sat up and started choking. I still had the tube in my throat. So I ripped it out. I had blood running down my chin and some nurse came in and starting shouting screaming. So that was my welcome back. Apparently, during the time I was out, I was able to respond by drawing. At any rate, during that time, the surgeon that messed up the initial surgery had filed for retirement. My sister was separating from her husband, or they were fighting. Or something. My little sister had a boyfriend. My brother had gotten an award at his sales job. It had been eventful. In such a short span of time. So many things had happened. And yet, it seemed like it passed slowly and quickly at the same time. It's a weird feeling. I was in a medically induced coma for a week when I was younger and I remember waking up and being almost senseless with panic. I don't really remember anything about being in a coma as such. But I had obviously somehow convinced myself that I was dead. It apparently took 3 days and a lot of confused crying because I was convinced that I was actually alive and not some ghost that people could see. And it took quite a bit of therapy after that to stop having nightmares. I was out for a week and a half. So many weird dreams while I was out. I truly thought I was in Japan at one point. I wasn't. It took a long time for me to understand where I was. I was bedridden for a month, so many tubes. I had them going directly into my aorta. And shit. And did inpatient rehab for another month after that so I could walk. You lose 2% of your muscle mass every day while bedridden. I was in a coma for 3 days while 5 months pregnant. I remember nothing. When I woke up, it was like nothing had happened. Except for catching up on the news. I heard nothing. Recall nothing. All I know is that people around me were terrified. I almost wish I'd felt or heard something more. Because looking back, the nothingness is frightening. My brain. My outlook. My memories. Nothing changed. And while I was still in the hospital, post-coma, obviously, my baby decided to be born. He was 5 weeks early and none of the nurses believed I was actually giving birth. They all just thought I was still just some woozy lady just out of a coma. Nope. After 3 kids, I knew what giving birth felt like. He was born 6 minutes after my water broke. Life is normal now. But I do something still think it's weird that I was in a short coma just a couple years ago. Back in the early 2000s. I woke up from a 2-day coma with a tube stuck down my throat to find out I was in a really bad car accident where the driver, childhood friend, passed away during the accident. I remember most of the day but don't remember stepping into his car and anything after that. Paramedic that visited me in the hospital said if he hadn't had gotten there any sooner, I wouldn't have made it. Was on heavy medication for 1 week and everything seemed like a blur. Strangely enough, there was a passenger in the back seat with no seatbelt on and all he had was a few bruises and a sprained ankle. This didn't happen to me but to a family friend. She underwent surgery 2 years ago due to breast cancer and there was some sort of complication and an infection. I don't know all the details, but she was in a coma for a month and was not expected to survive. Her husband, knowing that her survival was very unlikely, divorced her. I didn't know that was legal, but I guess since she was in a coma he was able to. Took their 2 kids, found a new, much younger, partner, and cut all ties with her family and ended up spending most of the money in their account on a boat and various other things to indulge himself. Then she woke up. I can't imagine how heartbreaking it was for her to wake up from her coma and face a long recovery with the knowledge that her husband had abandoned her. Her kids weren't able to come see her, and she had no money left since he had drained their accounts. The younger boy was really fond of his father's new girlfriend, but the daughter, she was 14 or so, was angry at having been forced to leave her mother. Eventually, this family friend finally got her life back on track without that douche. And her daughter lives with her while her son spends most of his time with his father, but she gets every other weekend and some holidays with him. Now she has a new husband and everything is going very well for her considering. I was in a coma for 7 weeks, and when I woke up the first thing I remember is the gagging feeling of them taking out my ventilation. I had no idea how much time had passed and cried when I found out. I remember staying awake for 48 hours after waking up because I had extreme fear of sleeping and could not remember how to breathe. I would panic regularly. I had injured my leg prior to being in a coma, and for me having to entirely relearn how to walk was the biggest surprise. Additionally, given the length of time I was in a coma, I woke up to a layer of fine baby hair all over my body because I had lost so much weight despite the feeding tube. I had sinus surgery in 2007, and this was supposed to be a pretty routine thing. I ended up waking up in a hospital 36 hours later. I went into a surgical center to have this procedure done, extremely confused and unable to keep my O2 up on my own. My wife was there with me at times, and others she was gone. It was terrifying, because I kept lapsing in and out of consciousness. I lost a lot of memory around that time and the following week or two. They finally got me stabilized and home, but it was a very tough recovery. My mum was in a coma for over 7 months. She worked in a car yard and said that when she woke she was spun out by all the new cars out. She had no idea what they all were. Also, her favorite restaurant closed, which devastated her. But she could never remember that they had shut down. Had to break the bad news to her every week for about 6 months. Not me, but my father was in an accident as a child. He was riding his bike and was hit by a car. He spent 2 months in a coma. By the time he woke up, my grandmother's hair had gone completely white. She was 38. It's weird what stress can do to someone. I was in the hospital as an infant for a few weeks, and my father was so stressed out about me that most of his hair fell out in chunks. Went from looking similar to young Tesla to Homer Simpson. No offense to my father. My husband was in a medically induced coma for a week after a car accident. When he woke up, he said that he remembered getting to work. He never made it to work. The accident happened on the way, and that he had just been going about his normal day when he suddenly woke up in the hospital. He couldn't believe a whole week had passed. I guess he dreamed, for a week, that he was at work for 1 day. In an induced coma for 2 weeks due to a surgery gone wrong, resulting in sepsis. Had a hard time realizing those dreams for the past few weeks weren't real. Those dreams were scary shit. Being sodomized by extended family member. Watching my brother die. Having someone's head sawed off. Saw a face, but didn't recognize. Some weren't. Going back and forth on a train to my grandparents' house and back. Seeing the kids and wife. Various activities with family members. I had good dreams of those who talked to me in the coma. Bad dreams of those who didn't. Just love him because it probably was not a good experience. And you're coming off so many drugs that it takes a week to realize what is going on. I was in one for just 2 days, but when I woke up I couldn't see and struggled to breath for about 10 minutes. I was 16 at the time and really began to panic. I remember holding my mom's hand really hard trying to hear her. When I came to my senses I hallucinated a lot due to the medicine I was on. I still don't remember passing out, but I remember the day before clearly. My dad had heart valve surgery in a VA hospital in 2003. He developed an infection in the incision and they had to put him in a medically induced coma because he was really uncooperative and was going to kill himself. They did it at the request of me and my aunt. He was high on painkillers and couldn't make decisions for himself. When they brought him out of it, he kicked the Indian nurses out. This is important to the story. Once they left, he asked us where they had found him. Turns out he thought they had been a massive terrorist attack. The US was occupied by terrorist forces. That he had been caught up in said attack and was being held as a POW in the hospital. And that my aunt and I were visiting him due to the US government pulling some strings. He thought the nurses were his captors. He had no memory of his surgery or the past few months before the surgery. It all came back pretty quickly, but I still laugh about it 16 years later. I spent roughly 60 hours in a coma once. The doctors believed it was caused by some medication. But I'm convinced my brain just shut down because I was in so much pain. I never had a reaction to that medication otherwise. So their theory doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, the only thing really surprising to me was that I was in a coma at all. I have clear memories, even 20 plus years later, of events that happened in the room while I was supposedly out. I can't remember exactly how I felt when I woke up, but I really thought only the day had passed. Since I went into the coma at like 4 AM and came out of it at like 4 PM, I just thought it was the same day. When they told me it was 2 days later, I argued and told them the things I remembered. They did confirm these things happened. So, was I really in a coma? Able to see and hear? Or were my doctors morons? Guess I'll never really know. But I do lean towards morons. Simply because they then performed an unnecessary surgery, which was supposed to fix the problem. And the problem persists 20 plus years later. Veterinarian I know had a motorcycle wreck. Ended up in coma because the docs wouldn't amputate legs sooner and went septic. He also lost oxygen for 8 minutes and was in coma for about 7 days. None of the scans showed any brain activity and they were telling the family to pull the plug before the coma. But after the wreck, he was coherent and normal. After the coma, he could not recall information reliably. If he had met you before 5 years prior, he remembered you, but within that 5 years, it was iffy if he would remember you. His memories were incorrect. I worked with his son and it was one of the hardest things watching him go through that. It was hard on all of us watching our boss go from one of the smartest men we knew to not being able to recall anything accurately. He still has memory problems but otherwise is making progress toward healing. He was in the hospital for 8 months with surgeries and rehab issues. Was in a coma for 7 days, though I had varying states of consciousness throughout these days. It was not a medically induced coma. After I regained consciousness, I couldn't walk or move the left side of my body at all. The weird part about it was that I could remember walking and moving. I just couldn't make my body behave like I wanted it to. The strangest thing about looking back on this time, however, is the complete lack of terror I had, or indeed any emotion whatsoever, after waking up completely incapacitated. Even though my life had changed entirely, my personality was very different. 2. I was not in a state of mind to contemplate what this could mean or how I even felt about it. Over the following months, I learned how to walk again and gained most of my movements back on my left side, though I do still struggle with fine motor movements and my balance, especially in the dark. Not me, but a friend. He was in a medically induced coma for about 10 days after suffering an aneurysm, and then having another while in a coma. I sent him a message after he'd woken up, and he responded by telling me that he'd seen a guy neither of us liked when we'd been in the Navy together almost 20 years ago. I knew he'd been out for upwards of 10 years, but I thought maybe it was possible. Then he told me he was still in, and had done 22 years so far. I was confused, and doubted my own memory for a moment. A day or so later, his girlfriend contacts me. She tells me that his memory is all messed up, and he thinks he and she were in the Navy together. He's still in, and other things. She confirmed he's definitely been out for 12 years. She asked me to talk to him and try to help him regain his memories. It's scary how fragile memory is. My mother was in a coma for several weeks and detoxing from alcohol. When she woke up, she kept seeing little children and kept reprimanding them. As time went on, she started seeing less of the children and more of Donald Trump. He'd just been elected. She pulled me aside and told me to watch out, as Donald and his wife want a threesome with her. Later she told me she genuinely thought these things and it was confusing how she could see actual people so vividly. When I was 17, I was in a coma for 6 weeks. I woke up and had no idea what happened. Remember it later drug related. They never took out my contacts either, they fell out sometime. My tongue ring was missing. My right leg and left hand were both paralyzed. I remember having dreams and my surroundings were mixed into the dreams. It was creepy in a way. I have it be from a car accident when I was younger. I was in a medically induced coma for 4 days. My nana says when I woke up, I had absolutely no filter on my mouth. I said everything that crossed my mind. Loudly. Some of it was apparently very mean. I have nearly no memory of my life until about 16 years old. And even then it's only bits and pieces until I was 19. I'm 26 and still have almost nothing from my childhood. My grandparents took me on all these amazing trips when I was young. But I can't remember them. Even looking at pictures. Every now and then I'll remember something. But sometimes it's just my brain making up filler memories that didn't actually happen. I have to verify nearly all my childhood memories with my nana before I tell anyone. Because I don't know if they're true or not. Probably too late for this to get noticed, but here goes. A friend of mine was on some heavy drugs before I knew her. Like serious stuff. Her dad had been an addict since he was 11. She was the type of kid that with just one look you knew she didn't have a chance. Anyway, one time she OD'd really bad. She was put into a coma for a few days. When she woke up she was similar to a child. It was like her brain was rebooting. She's absolutely fine now and in college. But when I first met her she was incredibly slow to talk or respond. Mainly just smile blankly. I was sick. Later found out it was pneumonia. Anyway, I bought a bottle of Robitussin and chugged half of it forgetting I was on an MAOI medication. Super dangerous combination. That's the last thing I remember before waking up to a nurse pulling a tube out of my throat. Then standing up and trying to walk away but realizing there's an IV in my arm and a catheter in my dick. It still hadn't registered with me that I was in hospital, so this was all quite surprising. Bad motorcycle accident. I'll spare the details as it's a long story. Anyway, I was put under for my surgery and all that. Overall, didn't notice a thing. 1 second you're there. Then you're waking up. It was only an hour or so, but when I woke it felt like days passed. Honestly, was just thankful I was alive. I didn't care if I'd ever walk again. I walk and run no problem now. Although I only have one knee now really, but the euphoria after waking up totally changed my life.